So, all right, as mentioned, what we're going to do, try that again. What we're going to do today is we're going to go over Chapter 17 fairly quickly. All right, I want to be done by 9 o'clock with all these lectures. Tomorrow we're going to go over Chapter 18, and tomorrow I'm also going to give you some code, and we're going to take a look at it as well. Today we're not going to concentrate that much on code, but I do have a lot of references here, and a lot of them are W3 Schools references. I don't want to sit and read to you, but I just want to show you some of the stuff that they mention in here. Now, this chapter, as it says, is on functions, closures, and modules. So with functions, they go back and they do some review. In other words, they show you the standard way of creating functions. Then they show you function expressions, and then they show you arrow functions. Now, most people will tell you that today they use arrow functions because they find them the easiest to work with and the least amount of code. That said, I've talked to other people who are like, I hate them. And I'm like, why? Because they're confusing. Yeah, a little bit. All right? But anything that you do with arrow functions, you can do without arrow functions. You can do them using standard functions that are non-arrow functions. The reason that I mention that is arrow functions aren't going to take over. They're not going to supplant everything else that's there. It's not going to happen. All right? At least not while I'm around doing this stuff. You know, over time, it may end up that over time that, you know, most of the development is done with arrow functions, but there's so much code out there that doesn't use arrow functions, and that's not going to change. All right? So then we'll talk about closures, which is something new, and the chapter will end with modules. So as you can see in here, they have a couple applications. They go back and they rewrite that test scores application. Now, one of the things they're going to talk about in here with functions is something you've already dealt with, and that is the fact that when you can have default values. All right, and you've worked with them already. We used them in our last test. But they're also going to talk about what are known as variatic parameters. And what that means is I want to be able to, let's say that I've got 5 different classes and each one of them has a different number of students in there. If I want to be able to have a program that will handle and show me the high score, low score, and average score of each class, I don't want to write that 5 times. I don't want to, I want to be able to pass in arrays of any size and have the program handle it. All right? And that's one of the things they're going to talk about in here. Okay, they're going to go back and revisit talking about rest and spread operators, and all this stuff is connected. All right, then they go into, as it says, talking about the this keyword. And this means different things depending upon the context in which it's used. That's a little unfortunate, but that's the way that it is. All right, then like I said, we get into this test scores app, then we get into closures. You're not going to become an expert on closures. Not by reading this chapter. I mean, hell, it's less than 10 pages. There are tons of good articles out there. I'm going to show you a couple of resources that are out there that are good, etc. But this is the kind of thing that if you decide that if it's a year from now or whenever, for you guys at the end of 2022, all right, and I guess with you, in 2023 in May, that you want to go on the website and you want to be a full stack developer, you're going to have to know this stuff. This is the kind of stuff that you're going to be asked when you go in for interviews. All right? So, like I said, then it talks about a little bit about the module patterns, and yeah, that's actually a term, IFE, I-I-F-E, which is an immediately invocable function expression. And guess what? You already know what it is. What's different is where we've created function expressions, if you put 2 parens on the end, that means don't not only declare it right there, but immediately call it. That's the immediately invocable part. All right, we'll take a look at that, and then we'll get in a little bit into talking about ES modules. All right, like I said, the goal is to be done by no later than 9 o'clock. Now, you know what a function is, so I'm not going to go back and rehash a lot of stuff. But again, they come in here and they talk about a function declaration, a function expression, and an arrow function. So again, when we look at these, all right, there shouldn't be anything that's in here that's new or surprising to you. All right, and again, you're still going to find tons, and I'm not exaggerating, of apps out there that are written using standard function syntax. It's been around forever. It works. It's the easiest way to show people who are learning the language. All right? Not only that, to my knowledge, and I don't know tons of other languages. I probably know maybe 10 languages. I don't know programming languages. But this is the only one that I know of that has this arrow type of syntax. So the reason I'm telling you that is, for example, in C# next year, it's good, or next semester, I guess next year too, it's going to look a lot more like this, all right, than it will like the arrow functions and the function expression stuff. All right. What I like about this is they go back and they give an example of most of them. All right. And just remember, because again, you're going to be seeing this more and more right here. In fact, one of the programs that we're going to look at tomorrow is got this one, but rather than using the query selector, I use the document.getElementById. Now, I've been doing a lot of reading on that, and a lot of people are telling me, don't go using getElementById. Use query selector whenever you can. It's faster, it's more out there, it's more with it, it's more modern, etc. And it might be. All right. But they show you all this stuff, and remember one of the nice things about this is if all you're doing is returning something, you can condense that way the heck down, which is kind of nice. All right, so you can read that stuff yourselves, but hopefully you've got at least a preliminary understanding of this stuff. As I mentioned to you previously, and I'm saying it again, that probably the first couple weeks in the AWD 1111 class that's in fall, it's a review of this stuff. And in fact, your first test is doing some of this stuff before we even get into the working with Node and working with Express and working with React, etc. This stuff, it's all still being used. All right? All right. So again, we've talked about default parameters, and what they mention here is back in the olden days, like maybe 10 years ago or so, this is more the way you did it. You checked to see if something was undefined. In other words, you waited until you got into the function. Okay? Today, you don't have to worry about that. You should know when you look at this right here, all right, this is expecting you to pass in a subtotal. That must be passed in. But if you don't pass in a tax rate, it'll default to 7.4%. That should make sense to everybody. Now, I'm still looking for a really good reference on this, but when they first started doing this, and this is the way it works, I know in C# and it works in other languages, to my knowledge, unless it's changed recently, is default parameters had to go on the end. So things with default, if you had 3 parameters and one was a default, it would have to be the end one. I don't think that, at least in JavaScript, that's the case anymore. Probably should have went back and just tried to rewrite this and just flip these 2 parameters. That'd be an easy way to do it. All right? And, again, you can take a look at it. And as it says, you can assign a default value. All right? If you pass a null value to a function, it's used instead of a default value. All right, but if you pass something that's undefined, it isn't used. It'll use the default. All right, so again, already mentioned this, but going back and looking at the rest and spread operators, they're very much interjoined with one another. So it says in Chapter 15, we learn how to use the rest operator, the ... All right, and again, as it says, it typically is used because it gives you this nice syntax for creating what's called a variatic function. In other words, a function that will take an optional number of parameters. All right, and they show some examples of that in here. Now, some of the stuff you can do with this, it's kind of like, I can't think of a really good analogy, but it's kind of like, yeah, there are things you can do with this. It's going to be unbelievably confusing, especially if somebody else is going to end up maintaining your code, but you can do it. All right, that doesn't mean you should do it, it just means that you could. So when we look at this right here is the variatic parameter. So you'll notice this is expecting a tax rate and a subtotal. All right, a tax rate and 2 more things that represent the subtotals, the tax rate, and 4 things. So again, that dot, dot, dot that's right there means that you can have a variable number of parameters. All right? Now, notice the other stuff that you can do in here. Okay, so they've got this. So there's your number. You've got this. All right, whoops, you got that. And those are your subtotals. All right, then you can call it, and you can pass that in. And so there's another way that you can do it, in other words. They mention here that you can combine these things. It gets really confusing. It's funny because one of the things, I don't think I kept it up here, but that I was reading this morning was Bill Gates' advice to programmers. You know, you might laugh, all right, but I mean, the guy must be still be doing something right, all right? But one of the things that he said, I'm paraphrasing him, was to adopt that KISS principle. If the more simplistic you keep things, the better people can understand it. And if you want somebody to implement what you're doing, you make it easy for them to implement. All right, so some of the examples in here, although they work, are probably not the best way of doing it. All right, and then they say, here's a regular function that uses the arguments property. And they say, not recommended. Well, if something is not recommended, that doesn't mean you can't do it. It doesn't even mean you shouldn't do it. Typically what it means is there's a better way of doing it. All right? But when you're sitting there and you're programming, you're typically not going to have somebody looking over your shoulder, the programmatic police, to say you got to do it this way or you got to do it this way. All right. So jumping up to 572, it says, so far this book has shown you how to use the this keyword within the methods of an object to refer to that object. It says, however, in a regular function, the value of this depends on how the function is called. All right, that's one of the things that people don't like about it. That there are times when you're working on a program and something doesn't work, and you're like, why isn't this thing working? And you put a this dot in front of it, and boom, it works. This morning, I've been working on this thing for the students. It's not going to look like much to you, but we're building an electronic store. All right, and I'm basing it off of something. In fact, this is not mine. This is the one that I'm basing it off of. And you'll notice here, if I log out and I come in and I register and I come in and I put in my information, I'm in there as Jeff already, but let's just put in here. So I'll say name, JP Scott, the email, jpscott at gmail.com, which doesn't even exist. Well, it does, but it's not mine. And the password, I'll just say hello. All right, and I register. All right. Now, notice it's logged me in. All right. There are a lot of different ways of doing this. All right. And I based what I was doing with the students, I based it on this thing. All right. And what I don't understand is theirs works right here. Mine doesn't work. And I don't know why. It's virtually the same code. Plus, I've linked my database to this code now, and it's not showing my products. So I'm not a real happy camper right now, and that's what I'm going to try to work on when we get done, and that's another reason I want to be done by 9 o'clock. All right? But the point is, there were plenty of ways for me to do that. All right? And it's amazing because some of the errors that I got typically was saying, like, for one thing, I was returning an anonymous function, a function without a name. And it was giving me a warning, and when I went and looked up the warning, it said, just give it a name. You're not going to use it, but just give it a name. So I gave it a name, and boom, all the warnings went away. I had like 5 warnings. They all went away. Then I had another thing that was in there that says, hey, you've got to return this. And it was like, what the heck is wrong with it? I'm taking it right out of their documentation. And somebody, then I went and looked it up on Stack Overflow, and somebody said, yeah, they tell you to do this, but you really don't need it, and it's probably going to give you an error, so take out this line of code. I took it out, and boom, it worked. All right, there's not, other than places like Stack Overflow, there typically are not a lot of really nice resources that'll explain that to you, and that thing was like a paragraph long, literally 2 sentences. I don't know why they're telling you to use this when you don't have to. Take it out, and it should work. Okay. That's not really an explanation, to be honest with you. But I did it and it worked. Okay. All right. They mentioned, for example, that this works differently for arrow functions than it does for regular functions. Arrow functions don't have their own this variable, where regular functions do. All right? And again, they give you some stuff in here and how you can work with this and some examples of it. But again, it's going to depend on the type of code that you're writing. All right? Now, next semester, with a gentleman over here, when they're going to be in the Java/Android class, you use this all over the place. All right? And just let me tell you, in many languages, I just want to show you something real quickly. So if I come in here, get rid of that. Let me close that. And that. No, I don't think I need that. All right. And if I come in here and I write some code, let's go back. Let's see. All right. So this code isn't going to make a lot of sense, but I just am trying to show you something. All right. So if I come in here and I say something like this, so I'm going to write in here public. Don't worry about what this stuff means, but I'm going to say here string get name. All right. And it'll have something in there like this that'll say return name. Now, you can probably look at that, and that probably at least makes some sense to you. All right? And then when I've got a public void, and I've got a set name, then I want to pass in a name. All right? And you would think that, well, I can't really do this. I can't say name equals name. I mean, you can say that, and depending, you may or may not even get an error. But, again, when you're working with an object-oriented language, up here someplace, you're going to have something that's going to look like, kind of like this. Private, oops, not like that. Private string name, something like that. All right? But if you do this, what that does is rather than you taking name, so if I want to set name equal to Jeff Scott, all right, rather if I put Jeff Scott in there, it will take that, but this name that's right here, it doesn't know since it's got the same name. No pun intended. All right, but if I do this, now it knows that take the name that you pass in and set it to that name. So what I'm showing you, and now the C# language is also really incorporating more the use of the word this. It used to be when you wanted to close a document, you'd say me.close, and I believe now you say this.close. So a lot of it, is transcending amongst different programming languages, is what I'm trying to tell you. Not well, but I'm trying to tell you it anyway. All right. So you want more, you can go and read that in there, okay? It says in legacy code, that's the problem. There are billions of lines of legacy code out there that have been out there for years. They're not going to be changed, all right? So you've got to learn how to use all this stuff, fortunately or unfortunately. So they rewrite the test scores thing that they did back in Chapter 15, and notice what you can do now. You enter a new score. It's going to immediately push it in there onto your scores. It'll become one of the last three scores. So if we put 100 in there, all right, if we put 100 in there, you'll see 98, 94, 77. There they are. All right. So here we're going to have comma 100. This will now be 100, comma 98, comma 94. 77 will go by the wayside. That'll still be the low score. 100 would be the new high score. And we get a new average. That should make sense to everybody. All right? And again, you could build this. I have no doubt that you could all build this fairly quickly. All right? And if we look at the JavaScript for it, well, this is the couple of things that they're trying to show in here. All right? First of all, look at this. Const Invalid. Now notice they've got an arrow function in here. What are we doing? We're saying what? If it's not numeric, or it's less than 1, or it's greater than 100. All right? So if one of those things is true, it's going to set, it's going to, if the score is that, it's going to set invalid to true. Does that make sense? That said, probably you'd want to put a comment right there just to explain that to people, unless it was people who work with that kind of stuff all the time. All right, then we're getting the average. Now notice what we're doing here. All right, this array.reduce right here, what's it doing? Okay, it's taking and it's adding the current value that we have in there to something called total, which was initialized as 0, and we're adding 1 to it every time. So again, going back to what we just looked at, that's going to be adding 90, 89, 93, 91, 91, 87, 77, 94, and 98. All right? I mean, that's the way you've got to look at this stuff, where hopefully it'll make some sense to you. So it's going to run all of this right here. Okay? And then when it gets done with that reduce, then it's going to run this, where it's going to take that total and divide it by how many scores there were. All right, exactly what you think it would be. All right. Now, get last. Notice what it's doing here. That's the array. It says num equal 3. If you want to change that to maybe the last 5 scores, you just make that a 5. All right, that should make sense. All right. Then we're making a copy of the array. All right. Then we're reversing it. Why? Because we want it to go from the last one read in to the first one read in. All right, and then we're returning a cop from that copy right there. We're telling it to go from start at 0 and end with that. Now 1 before it, so 0, 1, 2. All right, and then they go in and they're using jQuery here. But again, this is stuff that should hopefully start to be making sense to you right now. So we've got an empty array called scores. This right here is assuming we've got something that's called add score. And what is that? Well, you'd have to go back to the HTML. All right? And notice what they're doing here. They are basically setting up an event listener. All right? So add score dot click. So when you click this, call this function. So what are we doing? If it's invalid, and we already called that, you saw that up above, that it's going to say the score must be between 1 and 100. All right, I probably would have made it 0, but that's totally fine. All right, otherwise, it says remove any previous text message, that's just clearing it out. Now, add to array and update calculations. So again, they're using variatic parameters right there. All right, why? Because the idea is, I mean, look at it with all of you. Yeah, there's 5 of you in this class, but we took 4 tests for HTML, 4 tests for JavaScript. And if I were to do something like that, and let's just say that's 8 tests, 5 of you, that would be 40 values that we'd have in there. All right? Now, when you start to do this stuff, all right, notice what we're doing here is we're telling it to join the stuff together. When you tell it to join it together, you better put some kind of a delimiter in there, because otherwise it's going to look like one huge number. All right? So you put a comma in there, and in that case, also a space. Now, that was quick, but really, hopefully at least, the stuff that's in there you can understand. All right? All right. So the next thing that's in here talks about closures. Now, I'm going to jump over here. All right? There's the W3 school stuff on functions, and it's pretty good. They talk about how to invoke a function, but this is real simple. These are standard functions. All right? Then I went from there and I said, okay, what else do they have? Then they have a thing on function expressions. And finally, what about this? All right, and that was in the arrow functions. All right, but let's see, there was the default parameters, and the spread and rest are talked about in here. All right, so this is what I wanted to jump into quickly here, and that's closures. This is not a simple topic to discuss. But when you work with closures, typically what you're working with is an embedded function. What that means is you've got a function within a function. which is totally legit. So again, imagine that I had a function here. I'm going to keep this, I'm not writing any code other than I've got a function here, and inside of there, there's some code, and now I've got another function inside of that function. All right, that's what we're talking about. Now, any variables that are defined in the outer function are available to the inner function. But the reverse is not true. If I define something in the inner function, it's unknown in the outer function. All right? So, I mean, keep that in mind. So as it says there, JavaScript variables can belong to local or global scope. You should know what that is by now. If something is locally scoped, it's been defined inside of a function or inside of a method. If something is globally scoped, it hasn't been. That's about the easiest way to put it that I can think of. All right? It says global variables can be made local or private using closures. Some of this is what I just mentioned. A function can access all variables defined inside of the function. Well, that shouldn't be anything new. Taking a look at that. All right? But a function can also access variables outside of a function. That isn't new. All right, so in here, this is a local variable because it's been defined inside of my function. Here, it's a global variable because it's been defined outside of my function. All right? Now, it says in a web page, global variables belong to the window object. They can be used and changed by all scripts on a page. All right? It's amazing when you start talking about this stuff. And what I mean is, some people will tell you, make everything in the world global. It's almost totally against what I've been trying to push at you. But the reason they're saying that is, it gets so darn confusing having to pass this to here, to here, to here. Sometimes you might have to pass it in some languages in one way. Sometimes you might have to pass it in another way, etc. So if you make everything global, you don't have to worry about it. Well, that is true. But if you make everything global, typically what happens is it slows the program down, because local variables are pushed to one area in memory, and when they're done with their job, they're removed. Global variables stay there as long as the program runs. And it's a heap in the stack. I mean, it's not that big a thing. But they're just different places in memory. But when you are working with global variables, they can eventually slow a program down. All right? That's why you're told basically not to use them. So a local variable can only be used inside the function where it's defined. It's hidden from other functions in scripting code. Global and local variables with the same name are different variables. In fact, typically, so what they're saying is, if I were to come in here and create a variable, so I said let x equal 7, and I came in here and said let x equal 12, and I came in here and I said let x equal 1, those are three different variables. All right? And what happens is the local one, it's what's known as it shadows the global one, which means that that one isn't known. All right? Now it says variables created without a declaration keyword are always global. This is why you put that using strict in there. Because if you don't have using strict in and you put this in, now you just, maybe you fat-fingered, maybe you meant to do this. But now A is automatically global. It's like you put it in and set it outside of anything, and it can be used anywhere. This is a really good way to come up with bugs and hard to track bugs. All right? So, again, this is kind of what I showed you. They live until the page is discarded. They have short lives. Okay. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, this is where it starts to get really confusing. Okay? And what I mean is, almost always when you see this stuff explained, they use counters. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's almost always the way it's done. All right? It says, suppose you want a variable for counting something, and you want this counter to be available to all functions. You could use a global variable and a function to increase the counter. So there's the global variable, and there's the associated function. Okay? And for whatever reason, now my machine just looks like it's locked. That ain't good. All right, there we go. All right. So that makes sense. If you called add 3 times, counter should now be 3. I'm not going to run that. That should just make sense. It says there's a problem with the solution above. Any code on the page can change the counter without calling add. When you make something global, you get what are referred to as side effects. Sometimes that's what you want. All right, so in this case, we'd want to change it. But if I came down here, down below this, and in the next line I said counter equal 127, it would work. All right, that would be an unwanted side effect. All right, so it says the counter should be local to the add function to prevent other code from changing it. All right, so we've got initiate counter, let counter equal 0, counter plus equal 1. Well, what's the problem? We already talked about this. Technically, it's making a local copy right there. Not only that, and some languages, and JavaScript does, but some languages allow for what's called a static variable. Static typically means 2 things. All right? The key thing, the key takeaway here is typically it's you set it once. But since this isn't static, it's being reset every time to 0 when you enter the routine. So you're adding 1 to it, so it doesn't work. All right. It says it did not work because we display the global counter. Why? Because we're outside of it. We're not displaying the results of counter in here. All right. It says we can remove the global counter and access the local counter by letting the function return it. All right. Getting better, at least we got a value now. All right, but every single time again, it's being reset to 0. So really it's 1 here, it's 1 there, and it's 1 there. Hopefully that makes sense to you. All right, so it says it did not work because we reset the counter every time we call the function. A JavaScript inner function, that's a function. Sometimes they're called inner, sometimes they're called nested, all right, etc. They go by different names. All right, so it says all functions have access to the global scope. In fact, in JavaScript, all functions have access to the scope above them. All right, so it says JavaScript supports nested functions. A lot of programming languages support nested functions. The only thing I tell you about nested functions is just be careful. They can be overused. In fact, in many programming languages, there is no limit. You can nest a function and a function and a function and a function, etc. And after a while, we talked a little bit about something called callback hell, but there can almost be a nested function hell, the same kind of way. All right. So it says in this example, the inner function plus, so that's in here, all right, has access to the counter variable in the parent function. So what do we have? Let counter equal 0, then we call plus, which just ups the counter by 1, and it has to be invoked, and then we return it. It says this could have solved the counter dilemma if we could reach the plus function from the outside. All right, it says we also need a way to execute counter equals 0 only once. All right, it says we need a closure. All right, it says remember self-invoking functions. What does this function do? And actually, this is an example of an iffy right here. See this? That's what makes it an iffy. That's an immediately invocable function expression. So that's saying, do all that and call it right away. All right? Because remember, being a function expression, all right, it's not, well, for lack of better words, it's not that smart. All right? So it says the variable add is assigned to the return value of the self-invoking function. All right? It says it runs only once. So that's this one. It runs only once. It sets the counter to 0. All right? It says this way add becomes a function. All right? This is known as a JavaScript closure. It makes it possible for you to have, for a function to have private variables. Now, I'm not saying did that make sense. I'd say if you want to know more about it, you want to understand it, read what's in the book, because I'm just trying to give you a little bit more than what they're actually showing in the book. All right? So whether that was better, the example is really the one they use isn't much different, just so you know the one that's in the book. All right. All right. And of course, how to work with the this keyword in closures. Okay. All right, then they go back. For whatever reason, there's a few things, and I like Muroc books. I'm not going to lie to you. I've gotten to know electronically some of the people who work there. They've always been very nice to me if I need something, etc. But there are certain things that they're enamored with. All right? And like these slideshow apps are one of them. All right? And they're just showing you that there is yet another way that you can write a slideshow using this stuff. Now, I would argue, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this, but I would argue again, when you're doing something like this, do it in the simplest way possible. All right? And that's not what they've done here. There's absolutely nothing wrong with what they did, but like I said, to me it's not the easiest way of doing something. All right. Jumping up to page 590, how to work with the module pattern. It says, many developers and third-party libraries use the module pattern to create a single object that has a private state. To do that, you use ifs. All right, that's typically what they're called. It says, in most cases, you use one statement to define a function expression and another one to invoke it. With an IFI, it's all in one statement. All right, it says the term IFI was coined before arrow functions were added to JavaScript. However, you can use the same technique with arrow functions as shown in another example that's here. All right, so they give you some examples. But again, the key thing is this. So notice what you've got here. You've got this function that's called say hello. And here's the actual function declaration and the function itself. There's the function invocation. So all we're saying in here is, hey, rather than having to call it, if you want to immediately call it, then just put the parens there, which is going to call it. All right? And it also, as it says, works with arrow functions. All right. Now, an IFI helps keep variables, constants, and functions out of global scope. That is always a good thing. Can help prevent name conflicts. Another good thing. If you have multiple developers working, and the chances are pretty good over time, if they're not communicating, they're going to use the same variable name to mean two different things. That's what they're talking about here. Can be used to create private state for an object. So again, you want a little more, take a read. All right. Then they talk about a couple of these module patterns. There are more than these. But the one they talk about in here is referred to as a singleton. And as it says, it's a pattern that creates a single instance of an object, hence the word singleton. All right? So this wouldn't be something that you'd be using, for example, like, let's say, in our bank account program. Because every time we create a new account, that would blow up the idea of a singleton. But they use it talking about their task list. Not for the tasks, but there's only one list. Doesn't matter if you've got 0 tasks in your list or you've got 100 tasks in your list, there's still just one list. So that would be something that would make sense. All right. It says sometimes having more than one instance of an object is what you want. All right. It says the module pattern allows you to combine the benefits of object literals and closures. This is probably about as heavy as this book gets right here. All right. So that what they're trying to do when they talk about this is they're saying, hey, again, multiple ways of doing the same thing. We're going to show you examples of both, and we're going to tell you the pros and cons of both. And you kind of make up your own mind, but even more than that, you're going to see both. If you get in and you're working on this for a living, you're going to see object literals, you're going to see closures, you're going to work with ifs, etc. All right. And then one of the last things that's in here talks about ES modules. Now, I'm going to jump back to here just for a second. All right, and where are we? That was the closures. You may or may not be aware of this. I don't know if anybody goes out and takes a look at the videos that I put out there, but over this summer, I got 7 free ebooks from this guy, Flavio Copes. All right, and I got his ebook on JavaScript, his one on React, his one on HTML, his one on CSS, his one on Node, his one on Express, and his ES5 to ES Next. Those 7 books. I could have gotten more, you can see, but those are the ones that I thought, pretty much were for the classes that we're teaching here. He puts a lot of stuff out there too, and he's got a blog, and I thought this was a pretty decent article because he explains in here iffies. It's not real long either when you take a look at it. And the way I look at it, the more examples of this you get, the more it's hopefully at least is going to make some sense to you. All right. Get rid of that. Come on, there we go. Now, again, notice in here, this again is in W3 Schools, so they talked about some of the features that became available with ES5. We've talked about some of this stuff. We by no means have we talked about all of it, but this is another good resource page, and you end up in the AWD 1111 class. Almost everything you do involves JSON, and JSON really has 2 different things: stringify to turn it into a string, and parse, turn it back into JSON type of thing. All right, so when you look here, a common use, it says, where is it? When sending data to a server, it has to be a string. So this wouldn't make sense, but what this would do is it would take this and turn it into a string. And with some software, you need to use JSON. So parse does the reverse. All right, so stringify will turn an object into a string. Parse will take the string and turn it back into an object. All right? And then there's this ES6 stuff. Again, we've gone through some of this stuff, not all of it. I'd say if you're going to look through here, one thing you'd want to look at would be promises. This is something that we talk about in the AWD 1111 class. And notice in here, of course, they don't have anything for it, but they also show JavaScript modules. All right, and that's what the last thing, that's discussed in this chapter. All right. It says closures and module patterns provide a way to give private state to multiple objects or to a single object. However, they are cumbersome, and they oftentimes result in code that's hard to understand. So it says to solve these, JavaScript introduced its own module system. The whole idea behind this, and we sort of got into it when we were talking about library functions, but the whole idea is that you want to take a big problem and break it down into a series of smaller problems. All right? You're modularizing, hence the term modules here. And what you can do is you can define anything you want in a module, and then if you want to make that available to other parts of the program, you can do what's called export that module. If you export it, then you are making it available to other modules or other parts of the program. Those modules have to import it. So it gets exported so it can be imported. All right? And again, I'm not trying to bore you here, but I just wanted to show you this. Let's see. So this is one of the things that we're working on. So notice, there's an import statement. So if I go out to that types file, all right, I could have just done one big export, but we're exporting each one of those individually. Sometimes when you do this stuff, you just have one big export statement at the end. Now, you guys have done a little bit of work with databases. You guys have basically done nothing with databases. All right, but I just wanted to show you this too, and that is this. We jump up here, and where are we? Go up one more. All right, so if I'm setting up a database, and these are things I want to put into a shopping cart. Again, I'm not saying this makes any sense to you, all right? But what we're doing here is, guess what? This const mongoose, what I'm doing right there in that first line is I'm importing a built-in module called Mongoose. It's not one I wrote, it's one that was written for me. All right, and I'm invoking that. Then I come in here and I say, hey, I'm going to set up a database, and everything in here will have a name, and that's required. Notice all of it's required. So it'll have a name, it'll have a URL for an image, it'll have a description, it'll have a brand, it'll have a category, a number in stock, a price, and a date that it was added. That's all fine and dandy, but look at the bottom. We're exporting it because other parts of the program are going to need to import it. There are two ways that you can do importing, just so you know. Sometimes you see the word require. Sometimes you use the word import. All right, they've tried to change it because many other languages use the word import. So one of the things, I think it was an ES6 or an ES7 thing, was to allow the import statement where you used to have to use require. All right. So they go through this whole big thing on importing and exporting. It's not exactly what I showed you, but it looks similar. All right, so there's the export, there's the importing. All right, and I'm not going to sit and read to you. You can take a look at it right there. When you work with this stuff, one thing I did want to mention to you that becomes kind of important, that these are not great examples, but there it is. This will work. That right here, you may or may not get what this means, but this line that's right here, that line, can't really highlight it because it's not letting me. But that line right there, notice it says /. That means the dot means the current directory. So / means under the current directory, there should be that file. So I'm importing it from that file. Let's say that it wasn't in that directory, it was up one directory higher. Do you understand what I'm saying? Then it would be // Sometimes you've got to put a lot of stuff in here because it gets to be really confusing. We've done a little of this. If you remember, we did some of that stuff when we were working with CSS. Sometimes you'd say ... like when you were in CSS, if you wanted to go and I don't know, reference something else. All right. Now, and don't worry about this. It says scripts that declare the modules, the type equal modules. Yeah. All right. Notice some of the stuff from modules. This is why we haven't talked about it in here. The big one is the first one. Must be run from a server. You've done nothing with servers this semester except when we brought in Node and you used that for GitHub pages. That was the only time you were doing anything that was server related, except using Git really is server related too. You're pushing stuff up, but it's not to your server. All right, what we end up doing in the AWD 1111 class is you use your machine at first as both a client and a server. Then you learn how to push it out to a public server, not GitHub. All right, but typically what we use in there is something called Heroku. All right, and I'll let you, again, you can take a look at the stuff that's in there. I didn't want to get too heavy into this because it gets really confusing real quickly. They talk about renaming, etc. That's all fine and dandy. All right, and then finally they come in and they rewrite the slideshow again, but they rewrite it. All right, and notice that they've got some stuff in here that they're importing. All right. So it says this version of the slideshow application works like the one presented earlier, except it uses ES modules to protect its private state. All right. That's pretty much it. So what we're going to do tomorrow, and I'm not going to lie to you, all right, I ripped this off from online, and when we get done, I'll show you where I ripped it off from. But I did change it around. All right, I added kind of my own take onto it, and I'll show you both tomorrow. But we're going to do this. I'm going to send you this. And at first I was going to have all of us key it in, but I don't think I'm going to do that. And what it does, it's got two examples here. I'll just bring up the first one. They look exactly the same. All right? But what this does, if I put a number in here, which I'm going to do, I'll put 3 in there. Okay? It's going out onto the internet, and it's finding an API, an application program interface, that's got information about numbers. All right, notice if I put in a 2 or a 3, all right, 3 is the number of semicircular canals the human ear has. Okay, probably didn't know that, I didn't. But if I change that and I put in another 3, do you see how it automatically refreshed itself? All right, that's what Ajax does. It does a partial page refresh. So when I go back there, notice the only thing that changed is the code that's in here. And guess what? You already know how to do that kind of stuff because you know how you can go and write out to just parts of a web page because you've done that before. We've used a div where you've written stuff out. That was a couple tests ago. All right, so we're going to do this. And there's more than 2 ways, but when you're doing it from the client side, there's typically 2 ways that you do this. All right, you either use what's called an XHR, which is an XML HTTP request object, all right, or you use what's called the fetch API. All right, and if you look, so that was the first one, and if you look here, so that was the XHR, but if I bring up the fetch, doesn't look too much different. And if I change this, I'll put in a 2 now. Notice the same thing happens. All right, so we're going to go over that tomorrow, and then we'll go over a fairly simplistic example of using Node on Thursday. All right, now I'm just going to ask this right now. Let me take this.